Hi, everyone. One of the four questions of the Passover Seder is, on all other nights we eat chametz, leavened bread, or matzah, unleavened bread. Why on this night do we eat only matzah? Chametz is any food product made from wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt that has come into contact with water and has been allowed to ferment and rise for more than 18 minutes. There's another word used for leaven in addition to chametz. When the enslaved children of Israel receive instructions for observing the first Passover night, when they eat the paschal sacrifice and paint their doors with blood, and receive instructions for the ritual throughout the generations, they're told that for 7 days they should eat unleavened bread, and on the first day to remove all leaven from their houses. The word for leaven here is se'or. It sounds a little like sour, and you can think of it as sourdough starter. Before the mid-19th century, there was no commercial yeast. Bread was made with starter dough or culture. It's been really difficult to get yeast in stores in the wake of the blossoming of home bread baking in the midst of this pandemic, so you may have heard that many people have started to make their own sourdough starter. This is done by mixing flour with water and then leaving it out for the bacteria and wild yeast in the flour and in the environment to start working together. Every day one adds a little more flour and water, and after several days feeding the starter, bubbles start to appear from the gases formed from the yeasts. When it's ready, anywhere from 3 to 8 days later, a portion of starter can be used to add to flour and water to bake into bread, and this sourdough starter accelerates the rising process. To keep a starter culture alive and active, one has to feed it either daily or weekly, depending on how often it's being used. One takes some prepared dough before baking and adds it back to the starter. And this process of tending to sourdough starter and using it in bread baking is what is being stopped before Passover. One tosses out the culture that has been growing and tended to all year and clears out the house of this and all chametz products that have come from it. There's a moment in the Seder when we hear an explanation of why we eat matzah. It's because we left bechipazon in panic haste, and there was not enough time for the dough to rise. And we commemorate that moment by eating matzah. But we're also making sure that we don't eat from the old. We're starting everything new. We're starting fresh. A new sourdough starter, a new culture will be created and cultivated. We remove the old dough and the old sourdough culture because sourdough starter embodies this continuity with the past. And in the in-between time, before the new sourdough starter is developed, we eat our simple matzah, just flour and water, so different from the human cultivated yeasty bread. Passover was and is a time to disrupt the other kind of non-bacterial culture, the culture of Mitzrayim, ancient Egypt, a culture in which human beings were seen as commodities, as subjects to be used, and not images of the divine. Passover is on the other side of the calendar from the high holy days when we throw bread into bodies of water to help rid ourselves personally of sin. The removal of chametz is a little different. It helps us begin again as a people, as a community. How might we understand the transformation that is facilitated by the removal of chametz and se'or, leaven and yeast, as we are experiencing this extreme, radical disruption of our society today as we live through this pandemic? We're in this very difficult and frightening time that is also revealing the fractures and brokenness in so much of our society and culture. We're experiencing a forced disruption where many have to act in haste to save lives, but we also have this time when our world is turned upside down to reflect on what comes next. What do we want the cultural restart to look like? We've been given this lesson in how interconnected we all are, for good and for bad, and we've demonstrated how we can meet the needs of this moment with a profound sense of caring and responsibility. We've uprooted our lives to protect other people, to protect healthcare workers, our seniors, the immunocompromised, as well as ourselves. We have this time to reflect on our worst instincts, which are driven by a false belief that we need to fight to get our share at the expense of others, often the most vulnerable. At our more reduced Passover tables and in each of our homes, I hope we remember that we have choices and not all is predetermined and so much is possible. I hope we will have conversations about how we might restart our culture in ways that bring about more equity, equality, justice, and compassion, and that we remember the greatest value above all, the sanctity of every human life. Chag Sameach, wishing you all a sweet and meaningful Passover.